Can you imagine a tidal wave of beer crashing through the streets of London? It sounds like a drunkard's fantasy, but in 1814, it became a terrifying reality. This is the story of the Great London Beer Flood, a disaster so bizarre it's hard to believe it actually happened. Our story begins in the heart of London, at the Meux and Company Brewery, a titan of industry right at the junction of Tottenham Court Road and Oxford Street. In the early 19th century, London was obsessed with one drink above all others, porter, a dark, rich beer, and Meux Brewery made some of the best. To keep up with demand, they built vats of staggering proportions. Picture a wooden tank, 20 feet tall, held together by massive iron rings, containing over 1 million pints of fermenting porter. It wasn't just a barrel. It was a multi-story building full of beer. The brewery was located next to a notorious slum known as the St. Giles Rookery. This was a place of extreme poverty, a maze of crowded tenements and desperate people, many of them Irish immigrants trying to scrape by. The residents of St. Giles lived quite literally in the shadow of this industrial giant, their fragile homes huddled against the brewery's massive back wall. They had no idea that this wall was the only thing standing between them and a disaster of biblical proportions. On the afternoon of October 17, 1814, a storehouse clerk named George Crick was going about his duties. Around 4:30 p.m., he noticed something concerning. One of the huge, 700-pound iron hoops that cinched the largest fermentation vat had slipped. This vat was filled almost to the brim with over 3,500 barrels of porter that had been maturing for 10 months. Now, these hoops slipped off a few times a year, so Crick wasn't overly alarmed. He calmly reported it to his supervisor, who brushed it off, saying no harm whatever would ensue. Crick was simply told to write a note to one of the brewery partners to get it fixed later. Business as usual. An hour passed. Crick was standing on a platform about 30 feet away from the colossal vat, holding the note he'd been told to write. Suddenly, without any further warning, the tank didn't just leak, it exploded. The immense pressure of nearly 1.5 million pints of beer bursting forth was catastrophic. The force was so powerful, it was like a bomb going off. The initial explosion slammed into a neighboring vat, knocking its valve clean off and adding its contents to the deluge. Several more large barrels were obliterated, releasing even more beer into the unstoppable torrent. A dark, frothing wave of porter, estimated to be 15 feet high, smashed through the brewery's 25-foot-high rear wall as if it were made of paper. Bricks and debris were launched into the air, raining down on nearby rooftops. But the real horror was unleashed on the ground, in the narrow cul-de-sac of New Street, right in the heart of the St. Giles Rookery. The wave of beer crashed into the flimsy tenement houses with the force of a tsunami. 2 houses were completely leveled in an instant. In one of them, a 4-year-old girl named Hannah Bamfield was having tea with her mother. The wave tore through their home, sweeping her mother into the street, but tragically killing little Hannah. In the cellar of the neighboring house, a family was holding a wake for a 2-year-old boy who had just died. The torrent of beer flooded the cellar, drowning the boy's grieving mother and Saville, and for other mourners. It was a tragedy piled upon another tragedy. The devastation continued. Eleanor Cooper, a 14-year-old servant girl, was washing pots in the yard of the Tavistock Arms pub when the brewery wall collapsed on top of her. She never stood a chance. Another young child, Sarah Bates, was also found dead in the wreckage of her home. The low-lying area had poor drainage, so the beer, debris, and mud quickly filled basements and cellars where many of the area's poorest residents lived. People scrambled onto furniture, desperate to escape the rising tide of dark, sticky liquid. Back at the brewery, amidst the chaos and rubble, all the workers miraculously survived. 3 men had to be rescued from beneath the collapsed vats and beams, but they were alive. In the streets, however, the scene was one of utter desolation. It looked, as one observer wrote, equal to that which fire or earthquake may be supposed to occasion. Now, you might have heard stories of what happened next. Tales of hundreds of people rushing out with buckets and pans to scoop up the free beer, leading to mass drunkenness and even another death from alcohol poisoning. It's a compelling image, but according to the historical records and newspaper reports from the time, it's mostly myth. The press, which was often hostile towards the Irish residents of St. Giles, made no mention of such revelry. Instead, they reported that the crowds who gathered were shocked and well-behaved. The reality was far more somber. The community was in mourning. The bodies of the victims were laid out in a nearby yard for their families to identify and grieve. The public, moved by the tragedy, came to pay their respects and donated money for the funerals. The 5 mourners who perished at the wake were given their own second wake at a local pub, a heartbreaking finale to their story. 2 days later, on October 19th, a coroner's inquest was held. The jury, after hearing testimony from witnesses like George Crick and viewing the horrific scene for themselves, reached a verdict. They declared that the 8 victims, including 3 children, had lost their lives casually, accidentally, and by misfortune. In legal terms, this meant it was an act of God. This verdict had huge consequences. Because the disaster was deemed an accident, Meux and Company Brewery was not legally required to pay any compensation to the victims' families. The event, however, almost bankrupted the company. The loss of the beer, the damage to the brewery, and the cost of rebuilding was a staggering £23,000, a fortune at the time. The brewery was only saved from collapse when it successfully petitioned Parliament and received a rebate of about £7,250 on the excise tax it had already paid on the millions of pints of beer that were now flowing through the London sewers. The London beer flood was a wake-up call for the entire brewing industry. The immense danger of these gigantic wooden vats was now undeniable. Breweries across the country began to phase them out, replacing them with more secure, often concrete-lined, vessels. Never again would a city be threatened by its tsunami of ale. The Horseshoe Brewery was quickly back in business, but its days were numbered. It closed in 1921, and the building was demolished a year later. Today, if you go to that same spot on Tottenham Court Road, you won't find a brewery, you'll find the Dominion Theatre. There's no plaque, no memorial to the 8 people who lost their lives in one of history's strangest and most tragic industrial accidents. It's a forgotten catastrophe, buried beneath the foundations of modern London. A story of industrial ambition, unforeseen disaster, and the human cost of a 15-foot high wave of beer. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe for more exploration into the weird and wonderful corners of history. See you next time.